Welcome to the ultimate gaming realm, and this is your curator, Dixon, logging on.
How's it going, everyone? Today we're going to do a video on the Sega Saturn Collection Vol.2. As you noticed from the first video, I wasn't actually on camera. I was only talking about the three packed-in games, which is this one here, Daytona USA, Virtual Fighter 2, and Virtual Cop. And I also was doing a review of these games at the same time. As you can see on the cover here, it says free games with purchase of Sega Saturn, Daytona USA, Virtual Fighter 2, and Virtual Cop. $189 value. Wow. Oh, and up here it says up to $15 off on any Sega Saturn games. See details inside. Okay, we'll check that out in just a minute. Take a look at the back here. These three cardboard CD cases. Nice. And three big instruction books. Of course, these are the actual big size of the actual game cases, the long boxes here, which is these ones. Of course, that's how they originally came out with it, as individually. Of course, the only issue with these ones is if you want to put these in a long box, it doesn't look too professional because the covers are not colorized. They're black and white for some odd reason. Oh, what the heck. See details inside. I don't remember. I think there was something else inside, but I might have thrown it away a long time ago. But whatever. And one other thing I forgot to talk about with the three packed-in games, is that the games do have awesome soundtracks. I already mentioned that. But I forgot to explain, they can also be playback CDs on any audio CD player or on the Saturn dashboard. That's really awesome. Or you can rip the music from the CD onto your PC hard drive if you have a CD or DVD burner. That's really awesome. Anyway, that finally concludes the three packed-in set. Now let's get on with the real purpose of Volume 2 episode of the Sega Saturn Collection. Oh, and one other thing. The gameplay footage in Volume 2 has been recorded around the same time the gameplay footage for Volume 1. So what I'm actually trying to tell you is the problems with the audio setback with video using the same capture device is still there. But if I ever make a Volume 3, which won't be anytime soon, I'm going to make sure it doesn't happen again. Okay, now let's get the show on the road. Starting out with the first game I got as a standalone for $20 at the time when I bought the Saturn from Toys R Us. The Saturn port of a groundbreaking PC game from id Software, Quake. Smooth frame rate, fast speed, and light sourcing. Better than the stock PC version. That's according to the Saturn World. Well, there's only one way to find out. Now waiting for the game to load. Now starting from the menu with this awesome industrial music composed by Trent Reznor, the founder of Nine Inch Nails and Nothing Records. Trent Reznor was a huge sponsor of this game, and the main protagonist, known as the Ranger, was also voiced by Trent Reznor. But we're not here to do a story on Quake. We're here to examine the Saturn port and compare it to the PC version. Now, some of you already know my stories on gaming limitations from the 90s, and getting a PC and running games with the proper specifications were tough back then. So the consoles were the closest access to the PC games as they get. Even though the console ports were not as good as the actual PC games, but at least the Saturn port of Quake was playable for the time. And it's still good looking back on that port nowadays for nostalgia purposes. But nowadays, like usual, since I have access to the PC port, That pretty much makes the Saturn port not worth much attention these days, because the graphics on the Saturn port look like shit when comparing it to the PC port, especially with the PC port using the 3DFX accelerator. And the Saturn port does have its limitations versus the PC port. Well, that's always been a common thing when it comes to home consoles versus home computers. And using the Saturn controller doesn't feel right to me when playing Quake. It just feels uncomfortable anymore. And for some odd reason they gave the PC version of Quake an M rating. And then they gave the Saturn port of Quake a T rating. Yeah, I know the Saturn port is butchered compared to the PC version, but the Saturn port still had M rating content in it. Overall, the Saturn port of Quake is still interesting to this day. One of the main reasons why is that the Saturn port of Quake can also be a soundtrack. In other words, being an audio playback on either a CD player or the Saturn dashboard. And Quake on the Saturn is still recommendable in a way, for a fair deal. But the real way of playing Quake is on the PC. You can find Quake with its expansion packs for the PC on either Steam or Good Old Games. So that statement from Saturn World was indeed a false statement. But whatever. Next game. Another legendary PC game that's been ported to the Sega Saturn, as well as many other CD-ROM console formats. Myst. There's not a whole lot to say about the Saturn port of Myst. All I can say, it's a deteriorated port of a PC game, just like Quake. Myst is a pretty good game, but the CD-ROM console ports don't really stand out to the regular PC game. Especially with the Saturn port having inferior graphics, slower frame rates, slow loading times when moving to the next screen, and using a controller with a point-and-click game versus a keyboard and mouse feels quite awkward. And besides, the PC game has many updates of Myst, such as the Masterpiece Edition, Real Myst, and the latest, Real Myst Masterpiece Edition. Definitely going to talk about those versions eventually. But the Saturn port of Myst might have been decent back then, but not worth the time getting into since you have more access to the superior PC game. The next game will be another PC game that's been ported to the Saturn. Siberia. No, not the Siberia Adventure game series where you play as that lawyer chick. Which that series is pretty good too, but I would rather prefer the Siberia game that I'm talking about now. And it has absolutely nothing to do with the series with that lawyer chick. The Siberia game that I'm talking about was a classic mid-90s cyberpunk adventure game that was released on the PC, 3DO, PlayStation, and the Saturn. I actually remember renting the game on the PlayStation and had an awesome time with the game. You're a cyber agent named Zach and you're on a mission to take out cartel members and dealing with hacking puzzles while at it. The game is kinda linear, but there are some choices that you will make that will affect within the game later on. Siberia also has basic gameplay methods such as exploring, puzzles, fighting aircraft, and on-foot combat like firing lasers from your wrist gun. And Siberia is one underrated gem that I will be saving for an actual review. And it's a recommendable game on either platform, but like the two Saturn games before that, I recommend it more on the PC. And it's also available on goodoldgames.com and Steam. Now that was the last PC game port in this volume. So the last two Saturn games in this volume will be arcade titles, third-party arcade titles, starting with Revolution X. Just like Virtual Cop, Revolution X is an arcade shooter released in the arcades in 1994, developed and published by Midway. Then the following year, Revolution X was ported to home computers and home console ports. Then the following year, Revolution X was ported to home computers and home consoles. MS-DOS, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, Sony PlayStation, and Sega Saturn. The console ports of Revolution X was published by Acclaim, and the 16-bit cartridge games were developed by Software Creations, and the 32-bit CD-ROM games were developed by Raid Software. Like many other arcade games from Midway like Mortal Kombat and Terminator 2 the arcade game, Revolution X had awesome digitized graphics. Revolution X had a huge partnership with the legendary rock band Aerosmith, and Aerosmith are part of the story. Now that's what I call a huge promotion. A combination of rock and roll and gaming at its finest. The game, of course, features music from Aerosmith, along with original rock and music composed by Chris Granner and Vince Pontarelli. The whole soundtrack for Revolution X is quite fitting, and it knows how to rock the roof off when playing the game. And the plot of Revolution X is about a dystopian version of 1996, where you're fighting against a tyranny of rogue government and military officials that have taken over the world. And this combination of rogue government and military officials is now known as the New Order Nation, aka NON, NON. Headed by the lovely but deadly headmistress that goes by the name of Helga.
Stop this nonsense now, if you don't want to deal with me.
Her character was portrayed in other Midway games like Mortal Kombat 3 as Sonya Blade. She sure was a hottie. I'm sure she still is. Anyway, the NON, N-O-N, have declared war on the youth culture from age 13 to 30 to strip the fun and entertainment from music, TV, magazines, and video games. Also another way this rogue government's trying to take away our constitutional rights that's been given to us from day one. I'm sure there's a lot more to this story than they're telling. The player, or players depending on if you're playing a 1 or 2 player game, travels to the Club X in Los Angeles to see Aerosmith perform, but the band was captured by non-officials. So that's where the player comes in. Well, the player came in a few minutes ago before they were captured, so I guess I can say this is where the player really gets started. The player or players also seem to be well-trained members of the militia, since they got the skill for it, and they seem to know what the hell they're doing. The slogan for Revolution X, "Music is the weapon," must be the NON's weak point. The type of weapons used in Revolution X is the unlimited ammo machine gun and the CD launcher, which the CD launcher has 2 types of ammo, regular CDs and flame CDs. Revolution X also has interesting power-ups such as temporary super machine gun, a death bomb that kills every villain on one screen, a milkshake that refills your health, and more. You do get support from each Aerosmith band member in or before certain stages to stop the New Order Nation. Of course, the best way of playing Revolution X is in the arcade, but the CD-ROM ports were good, even using the controller. The kick-ass thing about the game is that Revolution X also has a CD audio playback, and I mainly rock out to the original music from this soundtrack, because if I want to listen to Aerosmith, I would listen to the regular albums. Now, the 32-bit CD-ROM console ports of Revolution X are as close to the arcades as they get. The 16-bit cartridge versions I wouldn't waste my time on. Now, not many people were fans of the game in general, and I do understand that, and the console ports of Revolution X did get a mediocre reception. Of course, the 2 cons about the console ports is that there's no light gun support for either console, and of course what I hate the most in any game is limited continues. There was actually going to be a sequel to the Revolution X game that features a hip-hop group, Public Enemy, but the sequel got scrapped due to poor sales on the console ports and the actual arcade game not being successful as Midway hoped. In a way, I probably wouldn't get too much involved with the sequel if they did release it, because I'm not much of a hip-hop guy, but I do respect the culture. I think I've gone with Revolution X long enough. Okay, the last game, which is also another arcade game ported to the Saturn. Street Fighter the Movie. Yes, they turned a video game into a movie. Then they made a video game based off a video game based movie. The actual Street Fighter movie was released by the end of 1994, and it was also based off the Street Fighter 2 series, with quite a few changes versus the Street Fighter animated movie, which that one is even more closer to the Street Fighter 2 series. Even though Street Fighter the movie was an actual live action movie that starred Jean-Claude Van Damme and the late Raul Julia, but the movie didn't do nearly well enough to win Street Fighter game fans over. And I would have to agree. It wasn't a good movie, but it wasn't nearly the worst video game based movie. I would at least rate Street Fighter the movie as a mediocre film. But what about Street Fighter the movie, the game? Well, it first was released in mid-1995 for the arcade, published by Capcom and developed by Incredible Technologies, and instead of animated graphics like the Street Fighter 2 series, the game had digitized graphics like the first 3 Mortal Kombat games. But the gameplay is still the same as the regular Street Fighter games, maybe a little stiff compared to any Street Fighter 2 games, but it worked. Now the console ports of Street Fighter the movie, the game, was released for Sony PlayStation and Sega Saturn later that year, this time developed by Capcom and published by Acclaim. And the console ports were quite as good as the arcade, if not better. Street Fighter the movie, the game, is actually better than the actual Street Fighter movie itself. Just like GoldenEye on the Nintendo 64 is better than the actual GoldenEye movie. Street Fighter the movie, the game, may not be as good as the regular Street Fighter games, but it is playable and enjoyable. I thought the digitized graphics were great, especially on the console ports, even though they didn't match up to the animated graphics from the Street Fighter 2 series, but it's acceptable. The soundtrack for the Street Fighter movie, the game, is also great, and it can also be played back on CD players as well. Even though the actual Street Fighter movie wasn't great, I want to say the same for the Street Fighter the movie, the game. So Street Fighter the movie, the game for the Saturn or the PlayStation is recommendable in my book. And possibly an arcade one if you can get your hands on a cabinet and have room for it. Or just use the main version.
You win. Perfect.
Now that's pretty much it for Volume 2. However, I do got some more Saturn games I would like to save for Volume 3. Whenever I get around to that one, I like add more Saturn games to the collection. But I'm going to make sure I have a good audio capture device for the Saturn, or find a better way of capturing the footage before I do any of that. And I also have other thoughts about doing these individually. Well, anyway, that was Volume 2 of the Sega Saturn collection. And once I get more added to the Saturn collection and get better capturing devices, I will definitely do a Volume 3. Until then, I'll move on to other collections and other videos. Until next time, this is Dixon of the Ultimate Gaming Realm logging off. Oh, and I do apologize about my bad unscripted intro and outro.